morning, Paul gave a great talk on how God is real to us, and I think one of the most important ways we make him real to others is through service and through missionary work, which is why you guys came to this workshop. Now, to give you a little background on me, the first time I really did any missionary work, I was a junior in high school, and that's when we had our confirmation program. And in confirmation, in order to get confirmed, you had to do service work. And they said, okay, here's the deal. You can either stay here in town to do service work, or you can go down to Mexico and work with the poor. Now, I didn't care. However, there did happen to be this one young lady in our confirmation class that I was absolutely head over heels infatuated with. And so they said, now raise your hand if you want to go to Mexico, and we'll put your name on the list. And I kind of look over, and her hand goes up. And I'm like, hey, the Holy Spirit's calling me to Mexico, too. I'm called to be a missionary. And so I went down to Mexico, and she actually fell head over heels in love with my friend, and she married him. And that's okay. So I went down to Mexico in a way looking for love, but I actually found it. Like, not in the romantic sense, because that's typically how we only look for it. But John Paul II says, man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself unless he experiences love. And the love I discovered, kind of captured when I was leaving Mexico, someone wrote on the dust that had settled on the back windshield of a car. They had written with their finger, once the dust of Mexico settles upon your heart, you will find no such peace elsewhere on earth. And it had been so true to me, because when I went down to Mexico, I went down there thinking, okay, I'm the one who has everything, coming to these people who have nothing to help them out. And then if you've been with the poor, they're the ones who have everything, and you're the one who has nothing, because the poor reveal to us our poverty. It's one of the great gifts they give to the church. They're a treasure of the church. St. Lawrence, who's one of our saints in Rome, he was there, and the prefect of the emperor commanded him, hand over to the church, hand over all the church's treasures to us. And St. Lawrence said, can I have 3 days to get them all? And they said, yeah, you got 3 days. Collect all the treasures of the church and bring them to the emperor. So St. Lawrence went out, and he collected all the blind, the crippled, the lame, the suffering, and the poor, and brought this massive crowd of the poorest and sickest of the church to the emperor and said, here, you have the treasures of the Catholic Church. Now, the prefect didn't think that was very funny, so he killed him, so I'm not sure the point got across, but he actually grilled him alive, kind of like a chicken on a barbecue. He actually grilled him. And the legend says that when he was being grilled alive, he actually said, you can turn me over, I'm done on this side. So it's kind of morbid, but he's actually the patron saint of chefs and cooks. But that's the Catholic Church for you. But anyway, he was on to something here. This is the treasure of the church. And I've been blessed in my ministry. I get to travel all over the world. I've been to every continent so far except for Antarctica. And I've encountered many of the poor. I remember being in Haiti, which is the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Most Americans make more in a week than they make typically in a year. And I remember driving down the street, and we were walking along, and they said, oh, you see that little tarp there? There's a woman who lives under that tarp. It's by the side of the street on a bridge, and she lives there. She's given birth under that tarp. She raises her kids under that tarp. And people know electricity. They bathe in the creek. And I remember when we went to Sunday Mass. I show up at Sunday Mass, and everybody is dressed to the nines. Suits, pressed dresses, girls with bows in their hair, just radiant beauty. And I asked the person I was with, I was like, they look impeccable. How do they even iron their clothes? They don't even have electricity. And she said, well, they get up early, and they put some rocks in the fire, and they heat them up. And then they put a towel around the rocks, and then they moisten that with water, and the hot cloth with the rocks inside, they press that against the clothes, ironing out any wrinkles so they can be spotless before God at Sunday Mass. And I'm coming from America where guys show up at Mass in cargo shorts, and a football jersey for Sunday Mass. And here they are looking like they're going to meet Pope Francis himself. But their poverty really opened my eyes to my own. I went down to South Africa. Their masses were 2 to 3 hours long, and they stayed afterwards to do more praise and worship. Nobody's looking at their watches. I went down to the Philippines. I mean, the poorest of the poor over there, and the place where I was at, and I go to a morning mass, 7 a.m., Tuesday morning. I walk in, and people are walking out. I said, did they already have a mass this morning? And they're like, oh, yeah, we have 8 daily masses at our parish. This is a Tuesday mass, 6:30, 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 5:30, 4:30, through the whole day, 8 masses, people packing in there. Their adoration chapel, nobody even wears shoes in there. You leave your shoes outside, and you walk in bare feet to adore our Lord. This makes me understand why when Mother Teresa came here to America, she said, this is the poorest nation I've ever been at in the world because of our spiritual poverty. And the poor open our eyes to this, to realize that they're a treasure to us. And you look at the church, we've got this great example of the popes and the saints of how to serve and how to do missionary work. I want to put up a first slide, give an example, someone we can look up to. Pope Francis here, Papa Francesco. Now, Pope Francis, I mean, he's awesome as it is. I mean, he's a fantastic guy. And there's a perfect image of his love. And if you look at this next slide, this is him, where a guy named Venizio from Italy, you may have seen this in the media, shows up at the Vatican, and he has something called neurofibromatosis, which means your body is covered with these painful, the things, they look like boils or blisters. And this was totally unscripted. Pope Francis didn't know this guy was showing up. And Venizio admitted later he wondered how the Pope would receive him. Because when you see a man that's covered from head to toe with these deformities, what would Pope Francis do? It'd be like, hey, God bless you there, or just shake his hand. Pope Francis immediately wrapped his arms around him, embraced him, and kissed him. And when Venizio walked away, he said, I feel like 10 years younger after that embrace. He said, I've gotten on public buses before, and when people saw me, they said, don't sit near me. Get over there. You know, maybe that's contagious. I don't know. Pope Francis didn't even ask. He just embraced the man. And this not only reveals how we should love others, it also reveals to us how God loves us despite our spiritual deformities, our sins, our vices, yet he embraces us. When the Father loves his Son, he looks beyond any of the ailments. He looks beyond what the world sees. My son, in first grade, last year, was in a play, and he got the role in the play, no kidding, he was the maggot in the play, all right? Now, I don't know if he had an audition for the role, but he got it, man, and he nailed it. And I remember being in the crowd. I got my little iPhone. I'm filming him. I'm like, that's my boy. That's my maggot right there. He's mine. And I'm like, you're the best maggot ever. And I was so proud. It's just the heart of the Father. And you see this in the example of Pope Francis, this example of just unconditional love that we have to image. You also see it in other popes. Next image guy, Pope John Paul II. This man, Pope St. John Paul the Great, man. This guy's the bomb. And I just finished writing a book on Pope John Paul II. And during writing the book, I got to meet all these people who knew him incredibly well. One was the next slide, which you see with him and a friend of mine, a Swiss guard. They're the guys that kind of wear the pajamas and they guard the Pope. And so this guy, Mario Enzler, I'm friends with his brother also, who's a priest, brother-in-law. His brother-in-law told me one day Mario is standing at the bronze doors of the Vatican. He's holding his halberd, the staff there, and this woman comes up to him with her little daughter, Carolina, and he said, she said, this is my daughter, and she's deaf, but she drew a picture of her farm, and she wants the Pope to have the drawing she made. And so Mario said, okay, I'll pass it on. So he took the drawing, brought it inside the Vatican, and gave it to Monsignor Stanislav Dziwisz, the Pope's secretary. And this is a drawing a little girl made, wants to give it to the Pope. So gave it to him. Dziwisz passed it on to the Pope, puts it in his envelope, and the Pope goes out to his Wednesday audience with about 7,000 to 10,000 people in attendance. And he does the Wednesday audience, and when it's over, he typically just leaves that way. But today was different. He just walked down into the crowd, and the Swiss guards are like, well, where's he going? What are we going to do here? And they're all rearranging, and he goes deep into the crowd, and totally unscripted, kind of parts the crowd a little bit, points to the little girl, says, come here. And this little girl kind of walks over, and he says, you must be Carolina. Boom, and he puts his hands on her head. He starts praying over her, blesses her, and walks away. The next morning, the Swiss guard said that her mother called the Vatican hysterical, saying, I don't know, but all I know is that my daughter was born deaf, and now she can hear. And this kind of thing, praise God for this stuff. And it would happen often. This kind of stuff would happen. Next slide, you look at this next guy. This is a cardinal in the church, Cardinal Francesco Martyrdom. And he had a surgery on an artery that supplied blood to his brain and his neck. During the surgery, because of a surgical error, the surgeon accidentally paralyzed his right vocal cord, so he could no longer speak. John Paul knew him and was friends with him and went out to him when he had heard of this. And he went to Cardinal Marchisano, and this is what he said to him. This is the actual words he said. He said, he went out to me, and he says, as a father, he came out to meet me. And for 2 or 3 minutes, he stroked the area where I had been operated on my neck. I was speechless. Meanwhile, he said to me, don't be afraid. You'll see. The Lord will give you back your voice. You'll see. I will pray for you. You'll see. The cardinal then hugged him as one hugs his own father, and John Paul was also moved and said thank you, and then his right vocal cord was unparalyzed. This would happen so often. This couple came to him. They couldn't have babies. Miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. And the woman cries out, "We can't have babies. We're infertile." And John Paul just smiled, traced the sign of the cross over her head, and said, "You will have a boy." And then they left the Vatican, took a pregnancy test, and discovered they actually were pregnant with a boy who they not surprisingly named John Paul, okay? So these things would happen so common, John Paul told his secretary he didn't want to hear about it. He says, look, we pray, God does miracles, you leave it at that. And he wouldn't even allow him to record these things because they happen so often. He was so humble. I mean, I'm not like that. If I cured someone who was deaf at this conference, I would put it on my Facebook in like 5 minutes. I'd put it on Instagram. Here's the deaf girl I cured. How cool is that? You know, so many shares I get. You know, but he was so humble because he knew it's not John Paul. It's the person of Jesus Christ in John Paul by virtue of his baptism that lives and acts. He was so empty in a sense, he allowed Christ to fully use him. So we've got these awesome examples like John Paul the Great. And you think, well, who could I can't do that. I can't heal people that are deaf. I can't cure the blind. But think of how many people in your life are actually in need of healing that you could actually reach out and touch in a different way. So we've got saints like that. Next saint, or soon to be saint, Blessed Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Now, Mother Teresa was the bomb, okay? Now, you talk about grit, you talk about courage. People think she's a little soft-spoken, little Albanian nun. Man, she was the big guns, all right? I'm telling you, she shows up in the 1980s in West Beirut, where there's a war going on. She shows up in Lebanon, and she says, I want to go into West Beirut because there's an orphanage of handicapped Muslim children, and all the leaders of the orphanage just left when the war came, and the kids are just abandoned. So she said, I want to go in there and get the kids. And they said to her, now, Mother, you can't go into West Beirut. There's a war going on. And she says, well, I want to go in and get the kids. And they said, look, you physically can't get across. He said, look, they killed a priest there last week because he's a priest. They could kill you, Mother. And she said, all for Jesus. And they're like, how do you argue with this woman? And they said, look, you physically can't get there across the bridge unless there's a ceasefire. You can't get across. And she said, well, tomorrow is the eve before Our Lady's feast day in the Catholic Church. And since Mary's feast day is coming up, we'll have a ceasefire in her honor. And they said, Mother, you know, I'm glad you're a woman of faith and you're on our side, but don't you think you're being a little tight with God, expecting them to resolve international conflicts according to the church's liturgical calendar? And she said, oh, no. She said, I've spoken to Our Lady, and I'm quite confident tomorrow the ceasefire will be in her honor. And he said, well, if we have a ceasefire, I'll personally make sure we send the Red Cross trucks to you first thing in the morning. And so Mother Teresa then, a priest friend of mine lived in Beirut, and he said she came back to the house, and she said, now it's time to go to work. And she brought out the Most Blessed Sacrament at 10 o'clock at night, and she did 6 hours of Eucharistic adoration from 10 at night till 4 o'clock in the morning. And then he said she got up from her knees, she had a little bit of coffee, talked to the sisters, and by 6 o'clock there was a press conference on the news that we have seemed to have had a ceasefire of sorts. She got on the phone, I would like the trucks by 7 o'clock, please. And all the vans showed up, and then you see her in the video just just walking into West Beirut. And this is actual photo of her carrying one of the 37 Muslim handicapped children out of that orphanage. You have the love of Pope Francis, the faith of John Paul the Great. You've got the courage of Mother Teresa, even other soon-to-be saints in the church. Like the next slide we got here, you may be familiar with this fella, Blessed Pier Giorgio Forsati. I mean, this guy's awesome. I mean, he's a tournament skier, mountain climber. I mean, look like a man's man. He looks like an Abercrombie and Filth model. I mean, just this studly guy. And by the time the dude was, 21 years old, he was personally paying to financially support 125 poor families out of his own wallet to take care of those families. Even on his deathbed, he died when he was 24 on July 4th, 1925. And on his deathbed, as he's dying from polio that he contracted from taking care of the poor, he's like nearly paralyzed, in great pain, and he just asks for a little pen and paper. And he writes down here's the medicine for that poor person, and make sure this guy gets his bus tickets. On his deathbed, in the prime of his life, still thinking about others. And when he died, they buried him, and this is a photograph of him on the day that he died, or the day after he died, on his funeral, so July 5th, which is my birthday, which is pretty cool. And so he's there, and this is what he looked like when they buried him. And they put it in the ground, the coffin, and then 50 years later, they took the coffin out of the ground because they knew he was going to probably become a saint to put that in the cathedral. And when they opened the coffin, this is what he looked like. The same thing. He's incorrupt. His skin was soft, his eyes were open, clear and shining, his hair was in the same place. The suit had started to corrode. The cross you see on his chest, the wood had begun to crumble. The metal body of Christ was resting on his chest, but he was perfectly incorrupt, like Saint Bernadette and many other saints in the Catholic Church. God giving us a little bit of evidence that there's a treasure of life that goes beyond the treasures that you see in this world, because he has stored up his treasures in the next world. So you've got saints like this, or soon to be saints, then other ones you may have never even heard of before. Like, check out this image. This guy is named Saint Clement Hofbauer. You've probably never heard of him. This guy had a great love for young people, and he would take care of boys in an orphanage in Europe. Now, he didn't have any money. All he did was beg for money to take care of the boys at the orphanage. So across from his church was a pub where wealthy guys would come and gamble. And they'd gamble, they'd drink. And so he shows up, and he sees these rich guys gambling with all their poker chips and money in front of them. And he comes up, and he said, "May I please have some of that for my boys at the orphanage?" And one of these drunk gambler guys spit a mouthful of beer into his face. And St. Clement Hofbauer took a handkerchief, wiped the beer and spit off his face, and he said, "That was for me. Now can I have something for the boys?" The man was so nervous and blown away by his self-mastery, just dumped all the money into his lap. Just take it. He didn't even know what to do. You've got people with such gifts, such virtues, like all of these saints. And what we learn from them is that what we have to bring, the gospel, it's one of joy. I do a lot of chastity talks, and people think it's just about following all these rules. Now, I was speaking at a public high school, and the principal was like scared to introduce me because he's like, what are they going to do to him? And so he gave the microphone to a senior, and he's like, "Here, you introduce the guy." And so the senior walks up, and he doesn't know what to say. He's like, "Today we have like an absence talk, and our speaker is Jason, and he's going to talk to us about sex and how not to have it. So here you go." And I'm like, "Hey, thanks, bud." But that's literally what they thought this message was. Like, a Christian life is just a list of rules and restraints. But ultimately, the gospel is a proclamation of joy. And we can learn it by looking at the lives of the saints. So where do we do this? You look at the images like we had up of Pope Francis, the next slide here, where he is embracing this man with neuro. Can you flip the next slide over to Pope Francis today? There we go. And so you look at this, it's like, okay, realistically, all these miraculous, amazing stories are kind of fun to hear, but how do we honestly apply this? Well, the question is, like, who is this in your life? Who is it that's so hard to love? Is this your alcoholic dad? Is this that person who hurt you 8 years ago that you've never forgiven? Is this that kid at school who sits by himself in the cafeteria? Is this yourself who you refuse to love? Do you not have an abusive relationship with someone else? Maybe you have an abusive relationship with yourself, tearing yourself to shreds every time you look in the mirror. Who is this unlovable person that Christ is calling you to embrace? Young people always want a challenge, and here it is. Love the unlovable. You don't have to go to Peru to go on some missionary trip. It's in your living room. It's down the hall. That's why the Catholic Church calls the family the school of love. Because everything you need to know of love, you learn from your family. Because if you can love the people you live with, you can love anybody on the face of the earth. It's not going to get more difficult than that. I mean, you want to do marriage preparation, don't go around and date 15 people. Love your family members. Because if you love them, you are going to be ready for the sacrament of marriage. And so these basic little tips, these are the simple things you can do at home. But God wants to test you there. Because a lot of us are like, no, that's great, Jason, but I want to get on stage. I want to do like speeches. I want to be on a band. I want to do all this stuff. And I find myself doing that. Of like, God, I know we spoke to 1,000. I want to speak 10,000. Once we do that, well, I want to be 100,000. We did that. Now we're over 1 million. Well, I want to be 10 million. And God's like, okay, you want to speak to 10 million people, but do you want to fast for 10 million people? I'm like, well, fasting makes me hungry. Can we just do like the motivational speaker thing? That's a lot more fun. Yeah, but God is testing us. Do you want to be noticed by men, or do you want to be known by God? And by doing the little acts of service, then he proves our hearts. Now you're ready to go on to something deeper. Because whenever I ask him, God, What are you waiting for? Let's go bigger. God's always says, you, that's what I'm waiting for. I'm waiting for you. You're not waiting for me. He needs us to reach a certain level before he brings us deeper. And so it starts something simple there, but then God might call you to do something more formal in the missionary field. Maybe work at a crisis pregnancy center, Life Teen, National Evangelization Teen. There's so many different ways that you can serve in your own community, doing little works of mercy and stuff. Start basic. When my wife and I, we travel, going to the airport. First store we go to is the magazine store in the airport, right? You go to the newsstand, and the first thing we do is we go to all the immodest magazines there, because you got the women's interest section, and it's all women on the cover of their own magazines. And then you go to the men's interest section, it's all women on the covers of the men's magazines too. And so the women are just more interesting. And so we get there, and the first thing we do, it's got all these like Maxim and Playboy magazines. Well, we take the most boring magazines you can possibly find in the store, like Oprah, Martha Stewart, Quilting Digest, Knitting Quarterly magazine, and we get these and we cover up all the immodest magazines, okay? It's a corporal work of mercy. You're clothing the naked, so you get some points for doing that. And it's a whole lot of fun. And what's cool is, if you pick a really good boring magazine, you'll leave on a trip on Tuesday, you'll come back on Friday, and that boring magazine is still sitting there. Nobody has touched it, and it's been hiding all the rest of the bad junk. And so when I get to like a bookstore, Barnes & Noble, first I fix all the magazines, then I go to the religion section. And they've got all these horrible books, like How to Play with a Ouija Board and Be a Good Catholic, all these just stupid books. So we take all those, and we like bury them in like the foreign cooking section of the store. And then they got this big shelf that says favorites. So I say, oh, those are from my favorites. So I take like St. Teresa of Lisieux and the Catechism of the Catholic Church and all this stuff, and I put it all up there, and God doesn't mind. He thinks it's funny. And then you can do all that stuff, and it's so simple. It's easier than we think. You don't have to stand on a street corner and scream. Part of our mission of what we do, we have a website called Chastity Project. We take everything we create, all our books, all our CDs, all our DVDs, everything's $2 on the website. So you can get these books and evangelize your campus with them, your college, your high school. We got public school versions, and everything's $2 or less, so you can get the cheap stuff and evangelize with it. So there's simple ways, but maybe God's calling you even deeper than that. There was a high school football player, or basketball player in Detroit. Went to Catholic high school, but he's living in the world. Sleep with his girlfriend, looks at porn, drinks a lot, goes to parties. And at the end of his senior year, he's talking to his buddies. The bud's like, hey, what are you going to do for college? You going to go to Boston College? You going to Texas A&M? Like, what are you thinking? And the guy's like, I think I'm going to go to the seminary. And they're like, what? You're going to the seminary. What is your girlfriend going to think about that? And he's like, no, I just think I need to check it out. And they're like, we didn't expect that from you. So this guy, Brian, goes off to the seminary. And he shows up, and he's a real rich kid. And a seminary is very, very austere. There's no carpet in the rooms. There's no air conditioning. And he didn't like that at all. So he brought in wall-to-wall carpeting for his room. He brought in an air conditioning unit, a stereo. He brought his pornography, his whiskey, and he started having parties in his room at the seminary. And the other seminarians are like, dude, I don't think you're going to make it real long here. It's just not the best fit. And so he goes on a silent retreat with the other seminarians. And while he's at this silent retreat, he hears God in the depths of his heart, not an audible voice, but he could hear God saying to him, Brian, make up your mind. Live in the world or live for me, but like it says in the book of Revelation, be ye cold or hot, but if you're lukewarm, I will spew you out of my mouth. And so he decided at that point, okay, I'm done living two worlds. And so he went home, sold his car, gave the money to the poor, threw away the porn, dumped out the whiskey, took out the carpet, gave everything away. And he started to have this deep love for the poor. He worked as a seminarian at a parish where he was in charge of answering the door at a poor area of town for the rectory. Poor people would come, he'd give them a cup of soup or whatever. Then when they ran out of soup, he'd go into the pantry. He'd start giving away the priest's food. And then they'd run out of there. He'd go in the fridge, give away the priest's dinner for that night to the poor guy. And then they said, well, we need some clothes. Oh, I got clothes. He'd go up to his closet, take out his clothes. He says, oh, we need bedding. He took his bed sheets off. He ran out his beds. He went into the other priest's room, took their pillows, took their blankets, took their clothes. And the priests were like, where are my clothes? What is going on here? And they said, Brian, what is going on? And he explained. And they said, Brian, your heart is so good. But, maybe God is calling you to a more radical form of Christian missionary work. Why don't you go over to Calcutta, spend some time with Mother over there? So he went to Calcutta, met with Mother Teresa, lived with her for a while, and then she told him, I'd like you to go be a missionary in Cambodia and Vietnam. And so he went over there, and at the time, the communism was taken over, and they made a declaration, all missionaries must leave the country or you'll be executed. A lot of them left. Brian stayed. He wrote a letter back to his seminarian buddies, and he said, I feel called to mix my blood with the blood of the martyrs for the sake of these people. And he stayed put. And one day, he'd go to a secret mass so no one could find him, but one morning as he was coming into the cathedral, the soldiers noticed him. It's kind of hard to miss like a 6-foot-tall blonde kid from Detroit in Cambodia, and so they pulled him out of the church, took him onto the steps of the cathedral, and they cut his head off, and that was it. Some people will look at that and think, man, what a waste. This young guy in the prime of his life, losing his life for this. No, not a waste. What a gift. What a waste is if he had wasted it on the whiskey and the porn and a life of sin. This life became a gift for the church, a martyrdom from a guy from America, a young guy who felt God's call in his heart, and he responded with generosity. And so how do you know? Like, what is God calling me to do in my family, in my vocation? What is he calling me to do? There's a couple ways to figure it out. First thing, if you take a peek in this next slide, it's just a real simple quote, but I think it says a lot. And it says, one slide after this one, or one slide after that one. Not this one, but the next one. There we go. I think it's all cropped off. But I don't know if it shows up on the next slide, but it says the place that God calls us is that place where, I think it says, our deep desire and the world's great hunger meet. So your passion, the first thing to ask, what is my passion? Is it unborn children? Is it the homeless? Is it evangelization? Is it chastity? Like, what is your passion? The first thing I think you got to do is really tap into that. Second thing, after you discover what your passion is, ask yourself, what are your gifts? What are your gifts? Like, really, I mean, everybody's got something. Maybe you're a good speaker. Maybe you're a good musician. You can design websites. Maybe you're good with crayons. Like, I don't know. Like, everybody's got something. And so the first thing you got to figure out, okay, what are my gifts? And I think guys and girls, to an extent, have different gifts and charisms. What is an obvious gift of a man? Typically, strength. Use your strength to serve. Go build homes for the homeless or something. Use your strength. I heard one quote for guys, how to use your strength. It said, look, if a piano needs to be moved, don't pick up the bench. Use your strength to serve. I know of one engaged guy who did this. On his wedding day, you've been to a wedding before. You know what happens after they get married? The bride sits down in a chair at the reception, and the groom comes up to her, and he kind of kneels in front of her dress. And then he reaches up her dress, and he pulls off her garter, which is this narrow band of fabric. And he pulls it down her leg, and then he throws it over his shoulders like a good luck charm to a bunch of like slobbering bachelors who fight over this thing. And so this guy on his wedding day said, yeah, that's not really how I want to introduce my bride to my friends and my family. So I'm going to shake it up a little bit. And so he had his bride sit down on the chair, and then he got down before her on one knee, and then he pulls out a pitcher of water and a bowl and a towel. And he pulled off her dress, and he took her shoe off, and he washed her feet as Christ washed the feet of his bride, the church, on the night before he gave his life for her. And this guy was not putting on a show for his wedding party. This is actually how he thought his bride should be served, with the love that Christ had for his bride. God is calling us to use our strength in this way. You women have a gift, a charism. I think you women have something unique called the feminine genius of what John Paul spoke about. Feminine genius is your capacity. There's a lot of facets of it, but you women can intuit things. Your brain is incredibly different from a male brain. There was this theory in the 1980s, well, boys and girls are really the same, and it's just gender stereotyping and cultural ideas that we impose upon them that makes them think they're different, but they're basically the same. Neurology says that is absolutely ridiculous. In fact, one of these sociologists said, look, I'll prove boys and girls are the same, and she had a baby girl. She said, I will give my girl all unisex toys. I'll give her boys' toys, girls' toys, unisex toys, trucks, guns, dolls, the whole thing, and you'll see, she'll just turn out unisex. And she said, after a while she gave up. She said, it's so frustrating. She said, every single night, my daughter insists on tucking each of her trucks into bed, one at a time. Good night, little truckie. Good night, little truckie. Good night, little truckie. It's embedded in her. The female brain, your ears, do you know you can actually hear sounds that men can't even hear? Different cadences and nuances and things in the human voice of inflections that are completely imperceptible to men. Your brain is fascinating. this stuff that it can intuit. My wife, she's got this feminine intuition. One day, I mean, she can hear all kinds of stuff. Like, she'll wake me up and she's like, honey, the baby's about to wake up. And I'm like, what? How do you do that? And the baby starts crying. I'm like, wow, I can't even hear the baby when they are crying. And you can hear them before they start crying. This is fascinating. And the other day, she's like, Jason, I had one of those, God moments where God was telling my heart to look in John Paul's ear. Now, John Paul's our son. She looks in his ear. Look at this slide. You'll see what she saw in my son's ear. If you can pull up the next slide, there's something in there. I'm like, what is that? So I get my iPhone and I kind of zoom in a little bit and show the next slide. It zooms in a little bit. So there's something. I'm like, ugh. I'm like, what is that? I'm like, is that some tumor or something? So I grab him. We run to the doctor. The doctor looks in there. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see what the doctor pulled out, which is a Starburst candy wrapper, okay? And after a thorough lecture to my son that that's not the best place to store candy wrappers, I told my wife, I said, thank God for your feminine genius. I said, because look, I clean his ears, but I don't look that deep in there. I'm like, if he didn't have you, that would have been in his ear till he was 30 years old and he was married and his wife looked in there because I never would have known. And the woman, your brain actually has these mirroring neurons. Men have them, but it's understood that women have far more, where you can actually feel what someone else is feeling, even if they don't even know it yet. You can intuit their sincerity much better than a man can. Your brain is going constantly. Neurologists say that a female neurological level is very high constantly. All night, all day, she's still thinking. The brain is always going. Males' brains actually go into periods of hibernation during the daytime while we're awake. Actually, turns off. And so what this explains, and so you're like, it makes a lot of sense now. But it's true. Like, have you ever said to your brother or your boyfriend or your husband or like, what are you thinking? And he's like, nothing. And then she's like, no, you can't be thinking nothing. What are you thinking? He's like, no, I'm thinking about nothingness right now. Like, no, what are you not telling me? And his cortisol, his stress is starting well, I don't know. And she's like, well, what are you feeling right now? He'd be like, I'm hungry. Like, no. Like your desire. What do you long for? He's like, pizza. Like, no. I mean, like an emotion, like fear. Like, what do you fear? He's like, this conversation I am beginning to fear. And it's like, but like the woman, it's amazing. You're so much more in tune with your emotions. Guys, it's harder for us to even perceive emotions. Like a lot of times, a guy doesn't even know you're upset until you're actually physically crying. And then he's like, ooh, something's wrong. It's like, very good. We're just different. And I saw this, just this Thursday night. I'm sitting home late at night, and I got my daughter Mary. She just turned 7 years old, and I'm with my 3-year-old boy, and we're making this Rapunzel Lego set, little princess castle. So I'm building it, and she's got the little Rapunzel action figure, and then the guy, whoever he is, like Thor, Gandalf, or whatever his name was. And so we're sitting there, and she's playing. My 3-year-old's there, and I'm building the whole castle, and she's got little Rapunzel, and she's like crying. She's like, ee. And my 3-year-old boy's like, why is she crying? And Mary's like, she wants to cry because she wants to. And Michael's like, and I'm like, that's just the beginning. I'm like, you just get ready because you're never going to understand that opposite sex. It's just the way it's going to go down. And so, but the point of all this fun stuff is that the woman has this incredible capacity to enter into the heart of another and experience their pain. They have hooked up husbands and wives to neurological MRIs or whatever. I don't know what it is, but they hook their brains up, and they would give each other shocks, where the scientists would shock the wife or shock the husband. And they found when you shock the husband and you tell the wife, now your husband is over there, and he's getting shocked, and 3, 2, 1, shock. They will actually see in the wife's brain a spike of pain, where she will actually feel what he's feeling. She's intuiting it in. They found they have been unable to duplicate that in the male brain, where the wife is getting shocked, your wife is being shocked, in 3, 2, 1, oh man, that's too bad. I'm sorry to hear that. Like, he just can't go there. So, but what this means is like, if you got that gift, of being able to enter into a human heart like that, you can either do great good or great evil with this gift. That's why sometimes a woman's words she can use to cut someone down with a verbal scar that will stick on their heart until they're 75 years old. But they can also use those words to go into a place to create tremendous healing and compassion and empathy. And so you got to realize, what are the gifts that God has given to me? Whether it be this feminine genius, whether it's been this strength, what is that gift that he's given to me? And then you start to think about your passions, you start to think about your gifts, and then I think you also have to, the third part is silence. You have to spend time in silence to hear what God is asking you to do. We have a quote from Mother Teresa. I want to pop up here real quick. As a great quote from Mother Teresa where she explains the fruit of silence. The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace. All of this chain begins with silence. We wake up every day to noise. You're on your phone within 5 seconds of waking up. Boom, input, input, input. We have almost no time and no room for silence. That's why many people say their favorite part of this conference is just being before the Blessed Sacrament. Nobody talking to you, nobody lecturing to you, nobody small group discussions, questions, friends, text, Instagram, just silence. Just you and him. Because the more the world deprives us of silence, the more I think we long for it. But if we're going to enter into that silence, I think it's only there that we're going to be able to say yes to God. And always keep in mind, as a teenager, the world was saved by the yes of a teenager. A teenage girl 2,000 years ago, in the silence of her heart, said yes to God. The world was saved by a teenage girl, 13 years old, 14 years old, that said yes, and redemption became possible. And so I think if you enter into the silence to understand, God, what do you want me to do? I'll serve you. And he's not going to speak to you audibly. You will be a priest. You will be a nun. It's probably not going to happen like that. But if you create that atmosphere of silence in your heart, he's going to start showing you what he's calling you to do. And if you live that out, you're going to find, like Mother Teresa said, that peace. And I promise you, if you ask God, what is your will for me, he's going to show it, because God answers prayers. When I was in New Jersey, I stayed with a bunch of nuns there. They had a program called Adopt a Nun, where you could financially take care of the living expenses of a retired nun, and in exchange, she'd pray for whatever you wanted. Now, I don't know how that gels with canon law, but they pulled it off. And so the media shows up, and they said, we'd like to adopt a nun. And they said, we want to do a story about this. And they said to the nuns, have you had miracles yet? And the sisters were like, well, yeah. And they said, well, what? And the sister said, here, look, call this married couple, and they'll explain it to you. So they called up the married couple, went to visit them. Turns out, husband and wife had like 5 or 6 miscarriages in a row. They couldn't have a baby, so they adopted a nun. And they asked her to pray for them so that they could have a baby. And the family said, oh, yeah, look, here's a letter that we got back from the convent. It said, dear Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, thank you for financially taking care of me. And in exchange for your generosity, not only will I be praying for you, I will have every single nun in the convent praying that you would have a family. But she said, P.S., be careful. Sometimes you ask God for an apple, and he wants to give you an orchard. Signed, Sister Mary so-and-so. And in case you're curious, their quadruplets were born on Father's Day, okay? So God answers the prayers, all right?